welcome to my channel. Today, we delve into a chilling tale that began with calm skies and gentle chatter, a flight that seemed so ordinary it could have been anyone's journey home. The passengers of Philippine Airlines Flight 434 boarded their Boeing 747 in the cool light of morning, unaware that beneath the calm hum of the engines, something far darker had already been set in motion. The air smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, the kind of scent that reassured travelers of routine and safety. Smiles, laughter, and the rustle of newspapers filled the cabin, while a quiet unease settled among those who had flown often enough to know that peace in the skies can sometimes be a fragile illusion. Among the sea of passengers sat a man who watched, silent, still, and patient. He carried nothing that would raise suspicion, but hidden deep within his belongings lay a device built not for travel, but for death. As the jet climbed higher, sunlight poured through the oval windows, scattering golden warmth across the aisles. The captain's voice broke the quiet, smooth and confident, as he announced their cruising altitude. Flight attendants began their service, trays rattling softly, passengers relaxing into their seats, and conversations melting into the hum of the engines. Yet somewhere within the cargo of trust that filled that cabin, a clock began its quiet countdown. No one could hear it. No one could feel the vibration of fate ticking beneath their feet. But every second brought them closer to a sudden end none could imagine. The man who had planted it was long gone, stepping off at an earlier stop, his face forgotten, his mission complete. Hours later, as Flight 434 glided peacefully through open skies, the first sign of trouble came not as a sound, but as a feeling. A faint tremor beneath the floor. A subtle shift in air pressure that made a stewardess glance toward the back, frowning. Before she could move, before the mind could even process fear, the world exploded. A violent flash tore through the cabin. The center seats erupted into a wall of fire and debris. The blast ripped through metal, glass, and flesh alike. Passengers screamed as smoke filled the air, oxygen masks fell, and chaos swallowed the serenity that had lived there moments before. The pilot's heart stopped for a moment before training took over, his voice trembling as he shouted to the co-pilot, "Decompression! Check systems!" They were flying blind in seconds, alarms screaming like the cries of the doomed, their instruments blinking red as warning lights painted the cockpit in desperate color. Inside the cabin, it was a nightmare no movie could capture. The floor had opened up like a wound, seats torn from their mounts, and cold air roared through shattered windows. Those who survived the blast clutched at anything they could, eyes wide, faces pale with shock. Some prayed, others simply stared in silence, the mind refusing to believe what the body already knew. The crew fought against terror, moving through smoke and twisted metal to calm passengers, to keep them breathing, to bring order to what had become a floating grave. One attendant, blood staining her uniform, guided a mother and child toward safety, her voice cracking but steady, her courage holding where fear should have won. In the cockpit, the pilots struggled to regain control, wrestling the wounded jet against wind, gravity, and death itself. Their oxygen masks hissed as they radioed for help, words breaking through static, fragments of fear and determination mixing in the storm of noise. The control tower, thousands of miles away, received the call, their calm professionalism fading as they realized the magnitude of what was happening. The voice of the captain was strained but resolute, describing a mid-air explosion, rapid decompression, possible casualties. On the ground, rescue teams began to move even before they knew where the plane would fall. Military and civilian eyes turned skyward, tracing radar blips and praying the signal didn't vanish. Every minute stretched like eternity as the crippled jet continued its slow, tortured descent toward an uncertain fate. In the cockpit, sweat ran down the captain's face as he calculated what was left: fuel, pressure, and hope. The controls shook violently, every vibration a reminder that one wrong move could turn their fight into fire. Yet they pressed on, clinging to training, faith, and sheer willpower. When they finally broke through the clouds, the coastline came into view. The The captain whispered a silent prayer as the runway lights appeared like candles in a storm. The landing gear groaned, one wheel refusing to lock, alarms still howling as the ground loomed closer. The cabin braced for impact, hands clutching seats, hearts beating against time. The jet hit the runway hard, metal screaming as sparks danced beneath the belly of the plane. For one breathless moment it seemed the world might end again, but it didn't. The wounded aircraft skidded to a halt, broken but alive. Silence followed, heavy and deafening, broken only by sobs and the faint crackle of emergency radios. Rescue crews swarmed the scene, pulling survivors from the wreckage, their faces pale but eyes still open. Amidst the chaos and smoke, stories of heroism emerged, of attendants who refused to abandon their posts, of pilots who refused to surrender to fear. Later, investigators would uncover the truth. The device had been placed beneath a seat in the center of the cabin, carefully timed to detonate mid-flight. The man who planted it was no ordinary criminal but a trained terrorist, testing his design for something far larger and far deadlier yet to come. Flight 434 had been a rehearsal for terror, a prelude to horrors the world would later know. But that day, even as the wreckage cooled and the skies grew quiet again, there was something indestructible in what had survived: the courage of ordinary people, the calm strength of pilots under fire, the will to live when everything seemed lost. And so, the story of Flight 434 stands as both tragedy and testament. A reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that evil can hide in plain sight, and that even in the face of destruction, humanity's instinct to fight, to help, to survive, burns brighter than any flame. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the sky's darkest hour. If you found this story powerful, and wish to hear more tales of survival and lessons from above, consider subscribing to the channel. There are countless stories waiting to be told, and together, we'll uncover them, one flight at a time. The explosion that tore through the cabin of Flight 434 was more than sound. It was a living nightmare that swallowed everything in seconds. Smoke billowed through the aisles, thick and suffocating, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of burnt wiring and blood. The cabin lights flickered wildly, flashing between brightness and darkness like a strobe of terror. A pressure wave ripped through the plane, stealing air from lungs, hurling loose objects like bullets, and throwing passengers against walls and ceilings. Somewhere in the chaos, a woman screamed for her husband, her voice vanishing beneath the roar of the wind that now howled through the torn fuselage. Others prayed, some whispered to no one, while others could only stare, frozen, trembling, unable to understand what had just happened. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, twisting like lifelines in a storm, but half of them were useless, burned or ripped away. A flight attendant, her hair singed and face streaked with ash, crawled through the aisle, trying to help a man whose seat was gone entirely, replaced by a jagged hole that opened straight into the night sky. In the cockpit, alarms screamed like sirens from another world. Red lights blinked in violent rhythm across the control panels, each one signaling a new disaster. The captain's hands gripped the yoke so tight his knuckles turned white. "We've lost pressure. Cabin breach midsection," he shouted, his voice cutting through the mechanical chaos. The co-pilot, eyes wide and heart pounding, fought to stabilize the aircraft as they dropped altitude to a level where passengers could breathe. Every movement of the controls felt sluggish, delayed, like wrestling with a dying giant. The autopilot was gone. The navigation systems flickered. Their instruments lied as airspeed indicators danced erratically, the plane's body groaning with every change in air resistance. But training is born from fear, and in that moment instinct took over. They didn't have time to think, only to act. "Emergency descent now," the captain commanded. The jet tilted nose down, engines roaring, as they dived through the thin upper atmosphere in a desperate bid to reach breathable air. Back in the cabin, the descent hit like a hammer. The G-forces pressed survivors into their seats, pulling screams from lungs already raw from smoke. Luggage compartments burst open, raining down debris. One terrified passenger clutched the armrest until her nails tore. Another held his child close, whispering words that sounded like comfort but were prayers disguised as hope. The cabin crew moved like ghosts in a nightmare, their eyes filled with terror but their voices steady. "Put your masks on! Stay down!" they yelled over the storm of panic, their courage holding the line where reason had already fled. The smell of burning plastic and spilled fuel filled the air, choking those who dared to breathe. Flames licked at the torn carpet, and the wind's howl mixed with the shrill of alarms to create a sound that was no longer human. Down in the cargo bay, smoke sensors blared as systems began to fail one by one. Wires melted, circuits fried. The very skin of the aircraft had been torn open, exposing layers of metal and insulation to the merciless cold outside. And yet, somehow, the engines still held. They screamed in protest but stayed alive, their turbines spinning against the odds, keeping the wounded giant aloft. In the cockpit, the pilots fought to regain composure, sweat stinging their eyes as they leveled the descent. "Control, this is Philippine 434, the captain said into the radio, his voice hoarse, breaking through static. "We've had an explosion on board, we've lost passengers, partial cabin integrity, descending now, requesting immediate emergency landing." The words carried far beyond what any voice should have to say. In the tower, silence fell before voices erupted in coordinated panic. Flight paths were cleared, emergency teams mobilized, and hospitals prepared for a disaster they hoped would not arrive. The descent steadied, but the silence that followed inside the aircraft was worse than the noise. The survivors sat in shock, the world around them wrapped in a trembling stillness. Smoke clung to everything: clothes, skin, thoughts. Some began to cry softly, their tears mixing with soot. A young man stared blankly at the seat ahead of him, where moments ago a stranger had smiled and asked for water. Now, only an empty, blackened frame remained. A flight attendant knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You're okay," she whispered, even though neither of them truly believed it. Every second stretched endlessly as they waited for another explosion, another noise, another sign that fate hadn't finished with them yet. The captain's voice finally came through the intercom, steady but heavy, a man carrying the weight of hundreds of souls. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've experienced an onboard emergency, but we are in control. We're descending to a safe altitude. Please remain seated and stay calm. We will be landing shortly." His tone was calm, professional, but behind that mask was the pounding of fear and the desperate calculations of a man trying to save what was left. He didn't know if the structural damage would hold. He didn't know if another hidden device was waiting to finish what the first one began. But he had to sound confident. Hope in his voice was the only thing keeping the cabin from unraveling completely. As the plane leveled off at a lower altitude, the wind softened, and the air grew thick again. The sound of crying returned, soft but human, fragile but alive. One stewardess moved down the aisle, checking for anyone who still breathed, her trembling hands brushing across arms, faces, pulses. She found survivors slumped in unnatural stillness and forced herself not to look too long. Her job wasn't to grieve. It was to keep going. The crew gathered near the galley, whispering to one another, trying to find strength in numbers. "We can do this," one of them said, voice cracking. "We just have to get them home." The captain radioed once more, the tower now guiding him toward the nearest airport. "Philippine 434, you are clear to land. Runway ready. Emergency services standing by." The words were clinical, but beneath them was tension. The fear that this aircraft, this wounded steel bird, would never reach the ground in one piece. The pilots exchanged a glance. No words needed. They knew this could end in fire or salvation, and they would fly through both if they had to. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the horizon in gold and blood. From the cockpit window, the captain could see the faint outline of land, a strip of hope against the endless sea. His hands tightened on the yoke. "Hold together," he whispered. Not to his co-pilot, not to the crew, but to the aircraft itself. The engines groaned in reply, tired but loyal. Behind him, 200 lives waited in silence, holding breath, gripping faith. Every vibration, every creak in the metal, every whisper of air became a prayer. And through the smoke, fear, and broken silence, Flight 434 flew on, scarred, burning, but defiant, as if refusing to die before its story was done. The calm after the explosion was deceptive, fragile, trembling, and soaked in the echo of screams that refused to fade. The passengers of Flight 434 sat frozen in a silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy with fear, every breath shallow, every glance toward the shattered middle section a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. The hole torn through the fuselage let in the howling wind, cold and relentless, whipping through the cabin like an unseen ghost. Papers flew, blankets twisted in midair, and the faint scent of fuel filled the lungs of those who dared to inhale. The sound of the engines had changed too, no longer steady and confident but strained, uneven, as if the plane itself was struggling to stay alive. The pilots, drenched in sweat, fought to bring order to the instruments in front of them. The altitude indicators flickered, the pressure gauges screamed warnings, and somewhere deep within the systems, electrical circuits sparked in defiance of the destruction that threatened to consume them. In the cockpit, the captain's voice was steady but his hands trembled slightly on the controls. The explosion had not only ripped through the passenger deck, it had shattered their sense of security, the one thing a pilot must never lose. "We're holding altitude," he muttered, though the words were more prayer than statement. The co-pilot's voice came shaky through his mask. "Cabin pressure's still dropping, sir. We need to descend again." The captain nodded grimly. "Do it. But keep her steady." Outside, the world was an endless canvas of blue and white, the clouds innocent and unknowing of the human struggle raging within the wounded machine. The aircraft began another slow descent, easing itself toward breathable air, where the survivors could at least catch the oxygen they needed to cling to life. Inside the cabin, flight attendants moved like soldiers in a battlefield they never trained for. Their uniforms were burned, their faces blackened by smoke, but their voices remained calm and commanding. "Stay in your seats. Keep your masks on," they shouted, pushing through aisles littered with debris and shattered plastic. One attendant found a young man slumped over, his face pale, blood streaking from a wound near his temple. She shook him gently, calling out, "Can you hear me? Stay with me, please." His eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again. She pressed her scarf against his wound, holding it tight as tears welled in her eyes, but there was no time to cry. Another passenger screamed from behind her. The floor near the damaged section was splitting, metal tearing apart like paper. Two men jumped to help, grabbing the edges of a broken panel, trying to hold it down as if their bare hands could mend steel. The cold grew unbearable as the temperature inside the aircraft continued to drop. Frost began to form on the edges of the windows, and the oxygen masks froze stiff with each exhaled breath. The noise of the wind and the engines merged into a single, haunting roar, filling every mind with the same question: would they make it? The captain's voice broke through the chaos again, softer now, steadier than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have sustained damage, but we are in control. We are making an emergency landing. Please remain seated and keep your belts fastened." His words were practiced, calm, but deep down, he knew control was slipping away a little more with every minute. Below them, air traffic control scrambled into motion. The operators had seen many emergencies before, but this was different. The voice from Flight 434 had carried a note that no amount of training could disguise: desperation. They rerouted other flights, cleared the airspace, and alerted emergency teams along the coast. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue helicopters began to move toward the expected landing zone, unsure whether they would be saving lives or recovering remains. News began to spread across radio frequencies. Explosion on board Flight 434. Aircraft attempting emergency descent. The words carried fear across borders, across time zones, across hearts waiting for answers that would not come soon enough. Meanwhile, in the cabin, a kind of eerie unity had begun to form among the survivors. Strangers held hands, children clung to mothers, and men who had never prayed before whispered quietly under their breath. The young flight attendant who had crawled through the smoke earlier returned to the galley, where she found another crew member crying silently against the wall. She took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We're going to make it," she said softly, even though her voice cracked. "They'll get us down. They have to." Together they began preparing the cabin for landing, clearing debris, moving injured passengers closer to the front, checking seat belt. Every movement was deliberate, every act of care a rebellion against panic. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot worked with precision, scanning what instruments still functioned, manually calculating descent and speed. They knew they were flying blind in many ways, relying on instinct and memory rather than automation. "We've lost a portion of the right stabilizer," the co-pilot reported. "Fuel levels steady. Engines holding." The captain exhaled slowly, his heart pounding but his mind locked in focus. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Outside, the sea stretched below them, vast, dark, and merciless. A single error could send them spiraling into its depth. "Not today," he whispered. "Not this flight." For a moment, a fragile peace returned. The passengers, though terrified, began to believe they might survive. The air was thin but stable. The engines no longer screamed but hummed with mechanical fatigue. The crew moved with quiet determination, a rhythm of survival pulsing through them. Yet beneath that fragile calm, unseen wires still smoldered. The explosion had done more than destroy, it had weakened systems that no one could see from the cockpit. Somewhere near the midsection of the fuselage, a small flame flickered, unseen by any human eye. It licked the insulation like a secret waiting to reveal itself at the worst possible moment. The captain had no idea what waited behind him, only the faint smell of smoke beginning to creep forward through the vents. He pressed a hand to the radio, speaking calmly, "We are declaring a full emergency. Prepare for possible fire upon landing." The tower responded instantly, "Copy that, Flight 434. Runway clear, emergency services standing by." The air was thick with tension, every heartbeat synchronized with the ticking of fate. Passengers began to see land through the windows, distant, shimmering in the fading sunlight. The coastline was their salvation, but it still looked impossibly far away. The captain turned to his co-pilot, meeting his eyes for the briefest second. "We're almost home," he said quietly. The co-pilot nodded, gripping the controls tighter. And as Flight 434 limped toward the horizon, its belly scorched, its heart wounded but still beating, the people inside began to feel the fragile spark of hope. Yet above the hum of the engines, deep beneath the floor panels, that hidden ember of fire whispered something else entirely, its own countdown, a cruel reminder that sometimes survival demands more than courage. It demands a miracle. The smell of smoke had become unmistakable now, sharp and acrid, burning into the throats of those who breathed it. It seeped through the cabin vents like a silent warning, turning every deep breath into a test of courage. The passengers of Flight 434 shifted uneasily, some whispering questions to the attendants, others too afraid to speak at all. Through the windows, the horizon was golden, serene, but inside, the reality was anything but peaceful. The aircraft trembled slightly as it began its final approach, its frame groaning under pressure, every rivet and bolt holding together through sheer will. The captain and co-pilot had already switched to manual control, their fingers slick with sweat as they fought both wind and gravity. "We're losing hydraulics," the co-pilot said, voice barely steady. The captain didn't look up, he didn't need to. He could feel it, the sluggish response of the controls, the resistance in the pedals. "Keep it level," he muttered, his jaw tightening. The runway was still a faint blur in the distance, barely visible through the haze. The tower's voice came through the static. Flight 434, you are clear to land. Winds steady. Emergency teams in position. The captain exhaled slowly, gripping the yoke tighter. Let's bring her home, he whispered. In the cabin, the crew moved with a practiced urgency that masked their terror. Brace position. Heads down, hands on your heads, shouted one attendant, her voice cutting through the roar of the engines. The passengers obeyed, some trembling so hard their seatbelts rattled. Mothers shielded children beneath their arms. Elderly travelers whispered prayers between sobs. A man in the aisle seat reached across to grasp the hand of a stranger he had never spoken to, and she held on just as tightly. The cold air mixed with the scent of fuel and fear, and every vibration through the floor felt like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. The faint flicker of firelight near the damaged section was spreading now, feeding on insulation, creeping along unseen wiring. One flight attendant noticed the smoke thickening, and without hesitation she crawled beneath the seats, searching for its source. Her lungs burned as she coughed, eyes watering, but she found it, a small, glowing ember licking the metal. She grabbed a handheld extinguisher, pulling the trigger until white foam burst forward, smothering the flame. It hissed, spat, then faded, leaving behind only a scorch mark. She leaned against the seat, gasping for air, whispering to herself, "Not today. Not here." In the cockpit, tension built like a physical weight, pressing on every nerve. The instruments danced erratically, fuel indicators fluctuating, alarms flickering on and off. Speeds dropping too fast, the co-pilot warned, scanning the displays. The captain adjusted the throttle carefully, his hands shaking. "Keep it steady. We're going to lose lift if we slow too much." He could feel the turbulence tugging at the tail, the uneven drag from the damaged fuselage threatening to spin the jet off course. "Flaps at 20, he ordered, and the co-pilot obeyed, his voice cracking as he replied, "Flaps 20 set." Outside, the landing gear groaned as it deployed, the sound echoing like thunder through the wounded frame. For a moment, everything seemed aligned, the descent steady, the nose level, the runway glinting in the fading light, but inside, the chaos hadn't finished its cruel dance. The passengers felt the plane dip lower, the engines straining as if in pain. One of the attendants, strapped into her seat near the rear, whispered a quiet plea under her breath, "Please, just let us touch ground." The sound of the engines deepened as the plane approached land, a low, animal growl that vibrated through metal and bone alike. Outside, the coastal waters shimmered beneath them, so close now that a few passengers could see waves breaking beneath the wings. Then the first jolt hit, a sudden burst of turbulence that threw the plane off balance. The cabin erupted in screams. The captain gritted his teeth, yanking the controls to correct the tilt. "Hold her steady," he barked. The co-pilot adjusted the thrust, but one engine began to sputter, coughing out black smoke as the gauges dipped dangerously low. "Engine 3's failing," he shouted. The captain made a split-second decision. "We'll make it on 2. Focus." Sweat dripped down his temples, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. The runway loomed closer, now just minutes away, its lights stretching like a lifeline through the darkness. In the back of the plane, panic began to spiral. The smoke had thickened again, curling upward in lazy, dark ribbons. A baby cried, its wails cutting through the din, and a woman clutched it tightly to her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering lullabies through tears. A teenage boy, face streaked with ash, stood and shouted, "We're not going to make it!" But another passenger pulled him down. "Sit. Sit down. You'll make it worse." The flight attendants shouted over the noise, commanding control, their voices sharp with authority that left no room for fear. The plane dipped again, the horizon shifting in the windows, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the world seemed to tilt completely sideways. Passengers screamed, grabbing at seats, arms, anything to hold on to. But the pilots fought back with raw instinct. "Leveling! Hold on!" the captain yelled as he corrected the roll, the aircraft shuddering violently but obeying. Now the runway lights were close enough to see clearly. The white stripes, the emergency trucks waiting, red lights flashing in the distance. The co-pilot called out, 500 feet. The captain nodded, eyes locked on the landing strip. We're bringing her down. The plane roared like a wounded beast as it descended, the wind screaming past its body. In those final moments, time seemed to stretch. Every heartbeat was a lifetime, every sound amplified, the rattle of the fuselage, the cry of a child, the hum of the engines giving their all one last time. The captain's mind narrowed to a single thought: land. He pulled back slightly, guiding the nose up just as the wheels met concrete. The impact was brutal. The entire cabin lurched forward, seatbelts straining, luggage bursting free from overhead compartments. Sparks showered beneath the belly of the plane as metal scraped the runway. One engine tore loose, tumbling into the grass with a roar that echoed like thunder. The fuselage twisted, the tail dipping dangerously before the captain corrected again, fighting to keep it straight. Reverse thrust, he shouted, slamming the controls forward. The engines howled in protest, slowing the beast's momentum as smoke poured from its sides. Emergency crews raced alongside the runway, lights flashing through the haze. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the plane screeched to a halt. Silence followed, a silence so deep it was almost unbearable. For several heartbeats, no one moved. The passengers sat frozen, unable to comprehend that they were alive. Then came the sobs, first a few, then dozens, until the cabin was filled with the sound of relief and disbelief. The captain exhaled slowly, his hands still gripping the controls. "We made it," he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. The co-pilot nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "They're alive." The flight attendants began unbuckling, rushing to open emergency exits. The smell of fuel was strong, but the fire crews were already there, spraying foam across the tarmac. Slides inflated with a hiss, and passengers began to evacuate, some stumbling, others crawling, all trembling. As they touched solid ground, many fell to their knees, pressing their palms to the earth, as if to make sure it was real. The captain was the last to leave. He turned back one last time, looking through the broken doorway at the cabin that had carried them through hell. The seats were torn, the walls scorched, but it was still standing. "You did good," he murmured softly to the aircraft, before stepping down onto the runway. Behind him, the emergency crews worked quickly, dousing hot spots and pulling survivors away from danger. The night was alive with flashing lights, shouts, and the crackle of radios, but above it all was the undeniable truth: they had cheated death. Yet, as investigators would later discover, the story of Flight 434 was far from over. The blast had not been random. It had been deliberate, calculated, a test for something much worse. The true terror of that flight was not just what had happened, but what it had been meant to begin. The night air outside the wrecked Boeing 747 was heavy with the smell of burned metal, leaking fuel, and smoke that drifted upward in thick, ghostly spirals. Red and blue emergency lights strobed across the runway, washing over the faces of dazed survivors and responders alike. Firefighters shouted commands through their masks, their boots splashing through pools of foam as they extinguished the final flickers of fire still clinging to the aircraft's belly. Paramedics rushed stretchers to the plane's side, pulling people out one by one, some screaming in pain, some silent in shock, some unable to move at all. The night was filled with sirens and chaos, yet beneath that noise was an eerie undercurrent of gratitude, a fragile relief that somehow, impossibly, most of them had lived through the unthinkable. But for the crew of Flight 434, survival did not bring peace. It brought questions. Dark, urgent questions that clawed at their minds as they watched their aircraft, once a proud machine of the sky, now lie broken and bleeding under the floodlights. The captain stood beside a fire truck, his face smeared with soot, his uniform stiff with sweat and grime. His hands still shook as he clutched the radio, his voice hoarse as he confirmed the number of survivors. He could still hear the explosion echoing in his skull, the cries, the sound of tearing metal. The co-pilot sat nearby on the tarmac, head in his hands, trembling uncontrollably. A paramedic knelt beside him, offering oxygen, but he waved it off, muttering, "It was under the seat." God, it was right under their seats. The captain turned sharply. "What did you say?" The co-pilot looked up, eyes wild with exhaustion and realization. "The explosion, center row. That's where it came from. Someone planted it." The words hung in the air like poison. Around them, investigators were already arriving. Airport security, local police, and soon, intelligence agents. Within minutes, the scene had shifted from rescue to investigation. The disaster that nearly claimed 200 lives was no accident. It was a message. Inside the remains of the aircraft, flashlights cut through the dark interior. Investigators moved carefully among the twisted seats and debris, photographing every inch. The smell of explosives lingered, distinct and acrid. Near the blast site, the floor had been completely blown open, revealing the structural bones of the jet. Scattered around the crater were fragments of wiring, metal shrapnel, and burnt fabric. One of the investigators crouched down, using tweezers to pick up a small piece of circuit board, blackened but still intact. "Timer," he muttered. Another man beside him nodded grimly. "Improvised explosive. Whoever did this knew exactly where to place it." They found traces of wiring running beneath the seat that matched no system on the plane. Someone had carefully hidden it, knowing the midsection would inflict maximum damage without destroying the entire aircraft. This wasn't random sabotage. It was a test, a rehearsal, a proof of concept for something larger. As dawn crept over the horizon, the survivors sat in blankets, silent and pale. Some stared at the wreckage, others clung to one another, unwilling to let go of the only people who could understand what they'd been through. One woman whispered to her husband, "It wasn't just bad luck. Someone wanted this." The captain overheard her and looked away, unable to speak the truth forming in his own mind. The airline officials arrived soon after, their suits immaculate and faces tight with corporate worry. They offered apologies, spoke of investigation, cooperation, and safety. But the pilots, the attendants, and those who had lived through the blast knew better. There was no comfort in corporate words when you had seen death just inches away. The investigation spread quickly across the region. Intelligence officers began retracing every stop Flight 434 had made that day. The manifest was examined, each passenger cross-referenced and questioned. The name that drew attention was one that didn't belong. A man who had boarded earlier, flown part of the route, and then quietly disembarked, leaving his luggage behind. Witnesses described him as calm, polite, and forgettable, the kind of face that disappears easily into a crowd. Security footage showed him boarding with a small black bag, then exiting hours later, carrying nothing. The investigators froze the frame, zooming in on the bag. The markings matched the blast radius exactly. It had been a bomb built to test, not destroy, to measure how much damage could be done, how quickly systems would fail, how authorities would respond. This was not meant to end with Flight 434. It was meant to begin with it. Back at the hangar where the wreck was being examined, the captain stood beside the damaged fuselage as technicians worked around him. One of the investigators approached quietly, holding a clipboard. "You and your crew saved a lot of people," he said. The captain didn't respond right away. His eyes traced the jagged hole torn through the metal, the black scorch marks like scars across the silver surface. "We didn't save them," he said softly. "The plane did. She held together when she shouldn't have." The investigator nodded, then hesitated before adding, "You should know, the explosive wasn't military. It was homemade but sophisticated. The timer was electronic, the placement precise. Whoever planted it knew aviation inside out." The captain closed his eyes, the image of his passengers flashing before him, the faces, the panic, the screams. "So he knew where to hurt us the most." In Manila, press conferences began. Reporters filled the halls, microphones buzzing, headlines screaming about sabotage and terror in the skies. The airline promised cooperation. The government vowed justice. But beneath the surface, fear spread faster than information. Other flights were suddenly suspect. Passengers looked twice at every unattended bag, every stranger who seemed too calm. For the survivors, normal life was gone. Each of them carried the sound of that explosion in their dreams, the moment when time itself had stopped. One flight attendant, now recovering in a hospital bed, told an investigator through tears, "When I saw the smoke, I thought it was over. But then, people started helping each other. They weren't screaming anymore. They were helping." Her voice broke. "That's what saved us. Not luck. Them." Weeks later, the full truth emerged. The man who planted the bomb had ties to a larger network, one that sought to use commercial flights as weapons of terror. Flight 434 had been their experiment. The device had been meant to test a new design, small enough to evade detection, deadly enough to destroy an aircraft in seconds. That day, by sheer accident, it hadn't worked as intended. The timer malfunctioned by minutes, sparing lives that were never meant to survive. But to the man who built it, the mission was a success. He had proven his weapon could work. The authorities knew then that Flight 434 was not the end, it was the warning. The captain never flew again after that. In interviews, he always said the same thing. When that explosion hit, it wasn't just metal and fire. It was the moment I realized how fragile life really is. Up there, every second matters. Every breath counts. You think you're in control, until you're not. He looked down at the scar on his hand, a faint reminder of the heat from the control panel that day. But even in that chaos, people didn't turn on each other. They helped. That's what I remember most. Flight 434 became a chapter in aviation history that the world would not soon forget, a tragedy that was also a miracle. Engineers redesigned aircraft systems. Security tightened around the world. And yet, for those who had been there, the memory of that flight was personal, unshakable. They could still hear the roar, feel the descent, see the light of the runway rising to meet them. And though the world would move on, for them, every time they looked at the sky, they saw not clouds, but the thin, fragile line between peace and disaster, life and oblivion, flight and fall. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when investigators returned to the charred skeleton of Flight 434. The wreckage still glistened with moisture from the night's firefighting efforts, a metallic carcass resting silently under the weight of dawn. The roar of engines, the chaos, the screams, gone now. Only the soft shuffle of boots and the click of cameras disturbed the air. The once mighty Boeing 747 stood as a broken monument to survival, its silver skin scorched black, its once proud wings drooping toward the ground as if mourning what had been lost. For many, the sight was unbearable, a reminder that flight, something once seen as humanity's triumph, could be turned into a weapon of fear in an instant. And yet, beneath that fear, there was awe. Somehow, this aircraft had endured what should have torn it apart. Inside a makeshift tent set up near the wreck, investigators and intelligence officers gathered around a table littered with photographs, debris samples, and flight data readouts. The lead investigator, a man with tired eyes and the calm tone of someone who'd seen too many tragedies, spoke quietly. "We've confirmed it. The bomb was placed beneath seat 26K. The passenger who occupied that seat disembarked in Cebu. He used a fake name. We believe he's connected to a known extremist network." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implication. One officer finally asked, "So this wasn't random?" The investigator shook his head slowly. "No. It was a test run. A prototype. Whoever did this wanted to know if the device could bring down a 747 midair. They wanted to know how the world would respond." His words hung heavy, each syllable carrying the weight of dread. Meanwhile, survivors were scattered across hospitals in the Philippines and Japan, each one haunted by memories too vivid to forget. For them, the investigation didn't matter yet, They were still trapped in that cabin, still smelling the smoke, still hearing the cries. One flight attendant, lying in a hospital bed with bandages on her arms, stared out the window as reporters gathered outside. When asked what she remembered most, she didn't speak of the explosion or the fear. She spoke of the quiet afterward. It wasn't silence, she said softly. It was a heartbeat. Like the plane was still alive. Like it wanted us to make it. Doctors called it shock, but deep down, everyone who'd been there understood. That aircraft had taken the worst humanity could throw at it and refused to give up. The captain, too, was recovering in silence. His hands still trembled when he closed his eyes, hearing again the muffled thud, feeling the jolt that had thrown him against the controls. But when reporters asked him about that moment, his answer was always the same. When the blast hit, I didn't think of myself. I thought of them, the passengers, my crew. That's what a captain does. You stay calm because they need to believe they're safe, even when you know you're not. He took a long pause, his gaze distant. We didn't just survive that flight. We fought for every second of it. The investigation stretched over weeks, then months, pulling threads across nations and borders. The man who planted the bomb was eventually identified, an operative working under the guidance of a terror mastermind whose name would later shake the world. What Flight 434 endured was only the beginning of a campaign that would redefine security forever. But at that moment, in 1994, no one could grasp what it meant. They only knew that something inside the human illusion of safety had shattered. Airport screenings tightened. Aircraft cabins were redesigned with reinforced materials. New intelligence networks were born out of that single blast in the sky. But for those who lived through it, all the policies and systems couldn't erase the simple truth. They had seen death, and death had blinked first. Back on the tarmac, under the now blinding sunlight, engineers worked to cut sections of the wreckage for analysis. As one panel was lifted, the scorched interior of the plane's frame came into view. Melted aluminum, shredded insulation, and a single, warped seat frame remained where the explosion had originated. On it lay a single piece of cloth, charred almost beyond recognition. A technician picked it up gently, holding it like something sacred. "This was someone's seat," he murmured. Another investigator nodded. "And it saved everyone behind it." The blast went outward, not backward. That single detail became the pivot point in understanding the miracle, how a change in angle, a shift in structure, a sliver of chance had kept Flight 434 from breaking apart completely. In the following months, Flight 434 became both a symbol and a warning. News networks replayed the story endlessly. The calm before the explosion, the chaos, the miracle landing. Survivors appeared on television, recounting their experiences through tears, their voices trembling as they relived every moment. Some spoke of newfound faith, others spoke of nightmares that refused to fade. The captain, always humble, refused to call himself a hero. "I did my job," he told an interviewer quietly. "But if you ask me who saved that flight, it was my crew. They didn't panic. They didn't give up. They fought for those people when everything said we were finished." His words became the heart of the story, repeated in classrooms, aviation courses, and documentaries around the world. And yet, behind the scenes, darker truths emerged. The same man who tested the device on Flight 434 would later orchestrate other attacks, ones that would claim far more lives and scar the world permanently. Investigators realized that Flight 434 had been the dress rehearsal for a new era of terror in the skies. The name Ramzi Youssef surfaced, a man whose ambitions reached beyond a single aircraft. Flight 434, they discovered, was his proof of concept for an even greater horror, the plan to destroy multiple planes over the Pacific simultaneously. What he failed to achieve that day, he intended to perfect. The survivors of Flight 434 had not just escaped an accident, they had survived the first spark of a global nightmare. But even in that darkness, something profound endured. The footage of passengers helping each other through the smoke, the calm voices of flight attendants guiding terrified souls toward survival, the captain's unwavering control. These moments became testaments to the resilience that defines humanity at its best. Where terror sought to divide, courage united. Where death tried to claim victory, determination refused to surrender. Years later, when the captain stood at an aviation memorial dedicated to the victims of air disasters, he placed a hand on the engraved names and closed his eyes. He could still feel the weight of the yoke, the heat of the explosion, the trembling breath of his co-pilot beside him. "We flew through fire," he whispered softly, "and came out the other side." Around him, the sky was quiet, blue, endless, so deceptively peaceful that it almost hid the truth of what it could hold. The story of Flight 434 would live on, not only in reports or archives but in the hearts of those who understood what it meant to fight against impossible odds. It was a reminder that even in the sky's darkest moments, there are those who will not yield, those who will guide others through the smoke, those who will hold the line between life and oblivion. And though the scars remained on skin, in memory, and in history, the legacy of that flight became a symbol of defiance against fear itself. As years passed, the wreckage was dismantled, the runway cleaned, the headlines faded. But somewhere, in the quiet hum of every plane that takes off, in the calm announcement of every pilot who says, "We're ready for departure," the spirit of Flight 434 still lives. It lives in the strength of those who fly, in the vigilance of those who protect, and in the unspoken promise that no matter how high humanity climbs, it will always find the courage to face the fall and rise again. Thank you for joining me on this story of endurance, loss, and courage among the clouds. If this story moved you, if it reminded you how fragile yet powerful the human spirit can be, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories that echo through history, tales of bravery, survival, and the will to live against all odds. Because every flight, every story carries a lesson, and every survivor carries the strength to teach it.